All right.
You should go to the 8 times.
We have started.
What's it supposed to do?
Okay. All right, we're up and running. Okay, guys, I'm back again for the third day this week. You guys won't have to see me after this week. But anyway, today's topic is intelligence and arms control. And when I say arms control, it has nothing to do with arms. We're talking about what? Mr. Kramer, what are we talking about?
Your guns control.
Okay, guns, right? Arms control in a military sense is not like small handguns and machine guns. We're talking about what kind of weapons?
Like air,
Ballistic
helicopter guns?
We're talking very large stuff. We're talking nuclear weapons, okay? So when we talk about arms control treaties between the United States and Russia and other countries, we're talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles. We're talking about bombers that carry nuclear weapons. We're also talking about air-launched cruise missiles that are nuclear capable, basically nuclear weapons, okay? The United States and the Soviet Union actually signed treaties as far back as the early 1970s to limit the numbers of nuclear weapons that both sides had. But those numbers were huge. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of weapons. In the 1980s, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a treaty in 1987 that eliminated the intermediate range nuclear missiles, specifically the SS-20 on the Russian side and the Pershing II on the American side. And that's how I ended up getting involved in all this, because they signed the INF Treaty, and then a few years later they followed that up with the START Treaty, which is the Strategic Arms Reductions talks, where we actually started cutting back weapons, and we actually had inspectors going on both sides that were watching the other side destroy weapons, okay, to verify that in fact they were destroying what they were supposed to destroy. So how was I a part of this big picture? I was assigned to what was called the Monitoring Operations Division of an organization called the On-Site Inspection Agency. The On-Site Inspection Agency was located in Washington, D.C., and our job was to be the U.S. monitors for all these different treaties we had with the Soviets and others. And so I got assigned to what was called the Monitoring Operations Division. We were the only permanent on-site inspectors. Everybody else would travel into the Soviet Union or whatever country they were going to. They would usually be there for a few days and then they'd be back. My organization, we actually had a site built in Russia at a little town called Volcano, and we were there 365 days a year, and we operated 24 hours a day. So we were really the oddball in this whole thing because we were there all the time. And now we didn't live over there the entire time. We would go over, we would deploy, the military guys like me, we would deploy to the site for 6 weeks, so we'd be gone for 7 weeks or so by the time you had time on the front end and back end travel time. So we were over there for 6 weeks, and our contractors, we had a bunch of contractors that were hired by, at the time it's called Hughes Technical Services Corporation, or company, and they provided various technical things. Like we had guys that operated x-ray machines for us. We had translators, because not all the military guys spoke Russian. We had guys that cooked meals on site, on and on. So we had a bunch of contractors on site and a few military guys. I have to tell you a quick story about being out on the site. I'll show you pictures in a minute. This little town is about 600 miles east of Moscow, which puts it just short of the Ural Mountains. You're almost in Asia, and you're kind of out in the middle of nowhere. I show up to the site for my very first assignment. There was approximately 30 Americans on the site, and I'm sitting around talking to some of the guys the first night I'm there. And this guy says, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Arizona." He says, "Oh, really? Did you go to school out there?" I said, "Yeah, I went to Arizona State." And the whole room starts like booing. I'm like, man, what's going on here? And all these guys had gone to U of A. They were hired by the Hughes Technical Services Corporation, which operated out of Tucson, Arizona. So they were all U of A grads. And so I show up, literally, there's 30 Americans in this remote site in the middle of nowhere. And there's like a dozen U of A grads and one ASU grad. And so I got grief in the middle of Russia for a bunch of Wildcat fans.
Nice.
So for the next 6 weeks, all I heard was scum devil this and scum devil that. And it's like,
Were
are you kidding
like,
me? In the middle of Russia?
Were you like a part of the ASU Go Sun Devils?
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan, the Sun Devils. But I just thought, what are the odds that in a small group of Americans, about a third of them went to U of A and I went to ASU? Come on, no way. Okay, let me show you some of the stuff that we were doing. This little picture, I was going to blow it up more, but unfortunately when I did it kind of got grainy and so you couldn't see it, but I just put it up there. This is Dulles International Airport, just outside of Washington, D.C. Washington has a domestic terminal called Reagan National, and then Dulles International. This is about 15, 20 miles west of town. These two buildings right here, these two buildings were the headquarters of our on-site inspection agency. So we were operating, a bunch of military guys and civilians operating out of a facility that was not a military base. So for that 3-year period that I was there, I rarely set foot on a military base. I wore a uniform, my uniform every day, but we actually operated at the airport. And the reason we were at the airport is because we traveled all the time. I don't know how many millions of dollars a year we spent on plane tickets, but we had a full-time travel agency located in our building that did nothing but take care of our travel arrangements. That tells you how much we were traveling, that it made sense to have a travel agent there. So anyway, this was our headquarters in Washington, D.C., and we traveled all over. Okay, does anybody know what this is? Very famous place. What is it?
The Kremlin?
That is the Kremlin. This is the Kremlin right here. This is the Kremlin. This square right here is a very famous square. Does anybody know what it is?
No.
You ever heard of Red Square?
Yes.
I know people that.
Yes.
In Russian, it's Krasnaya Ploshchad, means Red Square, and it is named Red Square. The name actually predates the communists. A lot of people think it was named by the communists, but it actually predates them. But this square, during the Cold War, the heightened tensions between the United States between the 50s and 90s, this square used to have all kinds of military parades. So when you would see pictures of military parades in Moscow, the crowds would be lined up here, and the tanks and missiles and all that would be coming through Red Square. This building over here is the Kremlin. This was actually built several hundred years ago. It's an incredibly massive structure, and it's brick. And imagine riding out of the woods. I mean, the biggest building you've ever seen is a little log cabin. Imagine riding out of the woods 300 or 400 years ago, coming into Moscow and seeing this massive fortress. Kremlin means fortress or castle in Russian. And this thing it's still impressive today, but I can't even imagine 300 or 400 years ago when you would ride into town and see this. It must have been incredibly impressive. The czars, the kings of Russia, would operate out of the Kremlin, and the communist government did too. So anyway, this is Red Square. Another quick little story for you. In the late 1980s, or let me back up just a second, Moscow has several airports that service it. The international airport is called Sheremetyevo, and they had 2 terminals there, Sheremetyevo 1 and Sheremetyevo 2. In the late 1980s, a young German teenager, about your age, his name was Matthias Roost, took a Cessna aircraft, put all kinds of fuel on board, and he flew all the way from Germany, and he flew right at ground level, basically, just above the ground so the radars couldn't see him. He flew all the way to Moscow without being detected by Russian air defenses and landed on this square. So it gives you an idea how big it is. So the joke in Moscow, we were driving around one day and the taxi driver said to us, he looks over and he goes, Sheremetyevo 3, meaning, 3rd terminal of the airport, because this guy had landed there. Needless to say, a lot of generals lost their jobs when Matthias Roost landed here because they had no idea that he had penetrated their air defenses. And this is not a short little trip from Moscow to the border. You're talking hundreds of miles that he flew and no one saw him.
That's pretty cool.
It was pretty amazing. He spent the next couple of years in jail before they let him out.
How did he learn how to fly?
He learned in Germany, and as a teenager.
How did he survive?
Well, they arrested him. They threw him in prison, and he was there for a couple of years. And eventually, after all the press and everything had died down, I guess they said, there's really no point in keeping him much longer, so they let him go.
Well, how did he survive the plane crash?
Oh, he didn't crash. He landed. This thing is so big that he landed his airplane there and rolled to a stop.
I thought he crashed his
No. This thing is huge. This is a very, very large square. Why did he do it? I'm not really sure. He might have said, but I don't remember reading.
Did he almost run anyone over, sir?
Did he almost what?
Run anyone over?
No. And this is, a lot of times, depending on the time of the day, it's, fairly open, but this is huge. So anyway, the reason I put this in is we used to fly from Washington, D.C. when we were on our way into the site. We would fly from Washington, D.C. to Germany, pick up supplies, and then we would fly, this was by commercial aircraft, to Moscow. And then when we got to Moscow, the Russians would take us on military aircraft out to our site. So just to show you, we didn't get to see a lot of Moscow on our way in and out, but at least once during our 6 weeks on site, we would get a trip to Moscow to pick up supplies, and we'd get 2 or 3 days to kind of rest and relax. So I got some pictures during those trips. This is, if I took the one picture a second ago looking that way, and then I turned around and took this picture. Does anybody know what building this is? It's one of the most famous in the world.
No,
Onion dome.
Yeah, these are typical Russian Orthodox onion domes. It's called St. Basil's Cathedral. It was a Russian Orthodox church, and then the Soviets shut it down for a long time because they were anti-religion. And then after the communists were thrown out, it started back up, and so it's decorated inside. It's a beautiful building. If you ever get a chance to go over there, it's really cool. Yes, sir.
Wasn't that hit by an earthquake, sir?
They've had damage for various things. I'm not sure about an earthquake, but it could have been. I'm not sure. Let me show you some others. This is one of the gates to the Kremlin. You can see how big this thing is. This is not a tiny little, 10-foot wall. This is like 50, feet tall. It's all brick. It's really impressive.
I forget the name of the town that you said that you served in. That was like a couple hundred miles.
That I worked in?
Yeah.
It was called Volcano. Here, looks like this. The place where I worked was called Volcano. It's about 600 miles east of Moscow. This is obviously me in the middle here, and this guy right here is an Air Force captain, a friend of mine named Dave Johnson. We went through Russian language school together, and I went off and did intel work in one world and ended up in arms control. He ended up working as a defense attaché, and so this is his wife Cheryl. They were stationed in Moscow at the same time that I was going in and out and working. And so usually when I would go to Moscow, I would stop and see them. And this was just us one day being tourists around Moscow. Yes, sir.
He worked as a what?
A defense attaché. I'm glad you brought that up because I'm using terms maybe you don't know. You guys know what an embassy is? Yes. An embassy is a place where the ambassador and their staff work, and they represent the United States in that country, right? The United States has an embassy in Moscow, a very large one, and we do a lot of interaction with the Russian government. Most of the people that work there are civilians, but assigned to the embassy is what's called a defense attaché office. And that's military officers and a few enlisted guys that work there to handle military issues between the countries. And so his job was to be an air attaché, an Air Force attaché. And so he was attached to the embassy staff, basically working issues between the U.S. military and the Russian military or government. Okay? Thanks for asking that. Okay, but anyway, that's a picture of the Kremlin. This is actually a building that was off to the side of Red Square. This is called GUM. It means Государственный универсальный магазин, which means like a supermarket, for everything, right? That's the Russian. But they shortened it. They shortened it to GUM, which were the first three letters of the words I just said, and they called it GUM Department Store. And it looks like a street. It actually has a roof over the top that lets the light in. And in the old days, this place was poorly stocked. It was a kind of a dismal looking place where you would buy normal everyday clothes and food and things like that. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, people have come in, the government basically sold it off, and now you can rent different stalls, and it looks pretty much like an American mall. It's actually a pretty nice mall now. And you can go in there, you can buy Nike shoes and Levi's and, Dolce & Gabbana stuff, and you name it, they got everything, right? The sad part about it, though, is the average Russian worker makes so little money that they really can't afford to shop in places like this. It's too expensive. So really the only people that you see here are people in Moscow that have money, which is minority, not the majority of the people. But it was such a beautiful place that I thought I would take a picture. Some of you, if you play Call of Duty, I think it's Call of Duty or Ghost Recon. If you're a gamer like me, if you play... it's Ghost Recon, I think.
Which one?
I'm trying to remember which one. Anyway, it's one of the games that was out about 5 or 6 years ago. They had a scenario where the Soviet Union or the Russians and the Americans were fighting, and some of the fighting was in Moscow. Well, sure enough, you fought your way through this mall in that game. And when I first saw it, I went, "Oh, they're going into GUM." Because I knew where it was on the map and, from being there. And as you went in, they had obviously gone over and taken pictures because the interior with the stairwells and the way that was set up looked just like the real thing. So they'd done their homework when they set up the scenario. It was pretty amazing. Yeah, since I'd been there, I knew that it was legit. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So now my secret's out. Yes, I'm a gamer. I love to play games. So anyway, I took this picture because something stood out like a sore thumb. There you go. See the big M? This area of Moscow is called the Arbat. The Arbat is an old like shopping area, and it still has all kinds of shops. You can see the old architecture. A lot of the new architecture in Moscow is kind of brutal looking. It's big concrete buildings.
I remember you showing me.
They're not very exciting. Yeah, some of you might have seen it. But the old part of town is still kind of neat. The architecture is kind of cool. This down here says souvenir, which means souvenirs. You can see the little nesting dolls, trying to sell to the Western tourists. And then you can see McDonald's over here. After being out on the site for about a month and not having access to restaurants and all that, I'm not a huge McDonald's fan, but I'd go to Moscow and say, man, I'm going to go get a Big Mac just because I can, right? And I remember reading a story. This place was always packed. You'd have to stand in line, and one of the things they had to teach the Russian workers when they opened up McDonald's was they had to teach them how to smile. Because Soviet workers, there was no big incentive for working. I mean, you got paid, whether you're a good worker or bad worker, you get paid the same amount. And so they weren't very friendly. And so when McDonald's opened up, they literally had to send the workers through a class to learn how to smile and greet the customer and all that. And they were actually quite good by the time I got there. But the years before I got there, apparently it wasn't so nice. Yes, ma'am.
Is that whole building like the
This-
McDonald's? Like,
This building here, the bottom part is McDonald's. That's just advertising.
okay.
But it is huge. Compared to a McDonald's in America, this McDonald's is very, very large. Because believe it or not, when this opened up in Moscow, this was considered really kind of exotic. And wow, we have American food and we can go. And so the Russians were really taken by McDonald's, and they still like it. And I think there was 6 or 8 or something by the time I left in 1999. But this was, I believe this was the original one.
It's like when I went to China a few years ago, and there was a McDonald's and a KFC that were pretty big, bigger
Right.
than the ones here,
Right.
and it was pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. Especially when you're traveling around the world and everything's so different, and then just every now and then it's like I just like a little tiny slice of America to make me feel comfortable, and then you turn the corner and there's a KFC.
Yeah.
Yes.
Except their KFCs they make their chicken spicy.
Right.
Even the non-spicy is spicy.
Right, and some of the side dishes, might be rice instead of fries, depending on the local market
The
and stuff.
Burger King there sells fried chicken with their cheeseburgers.
Right.
And I'm like, I've never heard of a Burger King do that.
Yeah, they have to cater to the local market a little bit.
I'd like
Yes,
to
sir.
let everybody know that America still has the largest McDonald's in the world.
And where might that be?
Oklahoma.
In Oklahoma, really? Like on the interstate or something?
Yeah, it goes over it.
I've seen one like that before. I don't know if that was the same one, but okay. All right, but anyway, this is the Arbat. This is what downtown Moscow looks like. And oh, by the way, just so you know, this is obviously summertime. In the wintertime, of course, there's snow like crazy, and the snow piles up on the roof, and they get these massive icicles that hang. And you walk out in the street. You don't walk on the sidewalk close to the building, because every year in Moscow, a couple people get killed by falling icicles. They're so big. They're so big, they will kill you if they hit you.
I was just talking about, I was like, I wonder if any have fallen off.
Yes, they have. So you'd walk out the street to get away from it.
Fascinating.
Okay, yes, sir.
I kind of wondering if the Russians would ever consider giving everyone in the city flamethrowers as self-protection from icicles.
No, it would be too expensive,
I
right?
don't think that would.
Yes, ma'am. This was, whoops. In the last picture, this was actually, you know what? No, that's not summer. This is probably, this looks like probably late winter as it's starting to melt off because people are still in coats. You're right.
Okay. I was gonna say,
But you can see there's snow on the sides, but it's not real deep and real heavy.
Oh, okay.
So it's
like
probably late spring.
Okay.
Late spring. I didn't put a date on it when I took it, so I don't know for sure. I mentioned that we would fly commercial aircraft to Moscow, and then the Russians would fly us from there. This is a Tu-154 Aeroflot aircraft operated by the Russians, and we would be the only guys on board. So this is like having a 737. You guys ever flown on a 737 like on Southwest?
No.
I mean, they're big airplanes. They hold like 100 and some people, right?
And then you just get
There would be maybe 8 or 12 of us, and we would get on board. The entire plane was for us.
That would be so cool.
And so you can see we're spread all over the place. This is a good friend of mine. We went through training together. His name's Rich Chapa. And I have to tell you another quick story because it's pretty funny. He was a male model before he went in the Army.
Oh my gosh.
And he was a male model. And we showed up together when we reported into the on-site inspection agency. The day we showed up, He was an Army major and I was an Air Force major. And we walked into the office together, and we went in to report into the commander, and the secretary was a lady, and she said, the commander's busy, why don't you guys come back in 20 minutes or so? And so we said, okay. And we walked around. There was kind of a half wall and some seats in front of it. We saw the seats, so we sat down. So she didn't know we were still there. She thought we'd left. And there was another lady working in the office, and we're beyond this wall, but we could hear them. And that's exactly what she said. She goes, oh my gosh, did you see that new major? He is gorgeous. And she starts talking, right? And we're just sitting there, and I looked over at him, and I go, man, it's embarrassing they're talking about me like this. We both knew they weren't talking about me. But that's when he told me, or well, not that day, but later on he told me that he had been a male model. And he was an excellent Russian speaker. He had just spent about 6 months working at the Russian brigade in the former Yugoslavia. This was right after the Bosnian War and all that, and the Russians and Americans and others were keeping the peace. And so he had just spent 6 months in the former Yugoslavia, walking through the hills with a rucksack on his back and all that. So he was already a good-looking guy, and now he was just looked like a man of steel. And so the ladies just loved him. And whenever I was having trouble getting stuff done in the agency, I would say, hey, Rich, can you go down to the whatever office with me? He's like, why? And I said, trust me, I will get a lot more done if you're talking to the lady behind the desk. And that's exactly what we did. Sometimes they would kind of like give me grief, and he'd walk up with me, and he'd start sweet talking these ladies. And it's like, my friend really needs so-and-so right today. And they're like, whatever you say, Mr. Chow. And man, I used to get all kinds of stuff. But anyway, this guy, Rich Chow, a great guy. He ended up being the defense attaché. We were talking, used that term before. He ended up being the defense attaché in Moldova, which was a small Russian republic that broke off from the Soviet Union when they split up. And that was the last I ran across him. But we worked together in the on-site inspection agency for a couple of years. So anyway, this is us flying out to Volcano. Actually, we flew to Izhevsk. That was the nearest town at an airport. And then we would bus over to Volcano. This is a picture of a kind of a typical-looking building in the town of Volcano. Volcano was a small, relatively small. I mean, it's a little bit bigger than Prescott. But it was out in the middle of nowhere, and the biggest thing going on in Volcano was an arms factory. They had started this arms factory in the early 1700s. You guys ever heard of Peter the Great? Peter the Great is one of the most famous czars the Russians ever had. He started an arms factory building cannon and muskets and those kind of things in Volcano back in the early 1700s. And they were still producing some of that stuff in this little town, but they had upgraded to intercontinental ballistic missiles. And that was the biggest employer in this town. This is also the birthplace of Tchaikovsky, if you've ever heard of the composer Tchaikovsky. He grew up here. His father was the manager of the arms factory, and Tchaikovsky grew up in this area, and so they got a big museum to him. Did you have a question, Brianna?
I'm wondering what the green stuff on the building is. I mean, is it...
Here?
No.
Or
Down?
this?
No, yeah. No, down.
Here?
Kind of, yeah.
This is mud. This is mud. When it's not snowing in the fall and spring, it's muddy because it's wet and it's, thawing. The summertime, which is only pretty short. I mean, we used to get snow well into April, and then it would start snowing again in September. So the summertime, it would dry up, but even then it would be muddy at times because of the rains. So most of this is mud. It looks green, but it's more brown. And some of these are plants and other things that are on the
It looks
buildings.
like moss or something.
Yeah, it does. It does. But this is kind of what you would see. It's kind of old and shabby. The Russians are not a very rich people. They have a very large military, they used to, and they spend a lot of their resources on weapons. And so they have some first world great weapons, but it's at the expense of how people live. Okay. To give you an idea of the difference, I think at one time I read statistics that said the United States was spending approximately 6% of our gross domestic product, which is the measure of all things that we make. We were spending approximately 6% on military. The Soviets, to keep up with us, were spending about 25% of their gross domestic product to keep up with us. That shows you how much more powerful the American economy is. To keep up with us, they had to spend that much. Okay? So it was at the expense of consumer goods and stuff for their people. This is how people lived outside of that building you saw. Most of the people in the town lived in log cabins like these. These were very typical. They made some very fancy windows and they dressed them up, but they're raw wood. And they would put an awful lot of effort into them. Most of them had electricity. They would burn logs and stuff like that for heat. But many of these houses still did not have running water. So they would have an outhouse in the back, just like a lot of places in America did 100 years ago. They have an outhouse, and it was not uncommon to see, especially women, walking down the street. There would be a communal well, and they would have a yoke around their neck. You know what I'm talking about? The wood thing that goes around your neck, comes off the two sides with the buckets. And they would literally take that down, and they would fill up the buckets, and they would carry 2 buckets back home with a yoke around their neck. These people were working in the factory that I was observing, making 21st century modern ICBMs, and they didn't have running water in their house. Amazing, huh? Yeah. But this is how most of the people in town lived. I'll show you a few more. More pictures of the same kind of stuff. You can see it's snowing. This looks like fall or spring. The snow's not super thick yet. And when the snow would come down, they don't plow the roads like we do. They just drive over the top of it. And eventually you might have 2 or 3 feet of snow you're driving on top of. Another street you can see, this is a typical city street. It's the pavement, what little they have is all broken up. They just don't have the money to keep it up. This is another one. You can see this is a major road here. This is a motorcycle with a sidecar. And I remember the first time I saw this, I thought, wow, that's interesting. They got a lot of these things. And then I realized from talking to the Russians that I worked with, a lot of people bought these. This was their only vehicle because they were much cheaper than buying a car. And when I first saw one of these, I looked at it and said, you know what those look like? They look like World War II German motorcycles and sidecars. You ever seen the movies with the Germans driving these? And one of the Russians told me they ought to. That's where we got them. I said, that's a World War II motorcycle? He says, oh, no, that's new. He says, but we took the factory from Germany at the end of the war when they captured the eastern part of Germany. They stripped factories out of Germany and took them back to the Soviet Union and put the equipment in and started building the stuff. That was one of the ways they basically paid themselves back at the end of the war, was to steal the German factories. So they brought this factory back to the Soviet Union and they started producing motorcycles and sidecars. And they had been producing that same model for about 50 years. And so you could basically get a World War II style German motorcycle that was built in the 1990s. Because they were still building. They said, hey, they still work. Why fix them? Why make them better? So anyway, imagine when it's 40 below zero. 40 below zero, that's your main transportation. It's cold. It is incredibly cold. Most of the year. Okay, let me show you a little bit about what we were doing over there. This is an aerial photograph that I took off of the internet. This is the Volcano machine building plant. This is where they were actually producing the missiles. And you can see various buildings here in the trees. Okay? The yellow line actually is a fence. They superimposed it here. But it had a wall that was about 8 to 10 feet tall. It was a concrete wall, about 8 to 10 feet tall. And then coming out of the facility, these are all connected to a rail line. And you can see the railroad coming out of the facility right here. So when we signed a treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, we built this facility to monitor what came in or came out of this facility. So we had 4 buildings. You see them right here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then there was a guard shack, and this was a warehouse that we used. And this over here was a rail spur that we could literally take. When the Russians would pull a missile out, they would back it into this, and then we could X-ray it. We had the right to go inside, but also to X-ray it. These 4 buildings here were named after the 4 presidents on Mount Rushmore. So what are they named?
Abraham Lincoln.
Washington. Roosevelt. And Jefferson. Yeah. So you had Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. Those 4 buildings. Co-created. That's what they were called. So basically, whenever the Russians wanted to bring anything that was above a certain size, approximately 14 meters long, whenever they wanted to bring it out, they would have to give us a notice, and they would tell us, we're going to bring a missile out in 30 minutes. They had to give us 30 minutes notice. We would get our team together. They would bring it out. We would measure it. We actually had an automated laser measuring system, like when cars and small things came out, so we didn't have to worry about them. We knew they were short enough. But when they came out by rail, they would give us a notification, And we would go out there and we would measure the length of the rail car, and if it was more than 14 point something meters, then we could enter the rail car. And these are big, big cars. So then they would let us in, and we would measure a canister. The missile was actually inside a canister. We would measure the canister and say, okay, that is about the size of a so-and-so missile. And then we would take it, hook it up, and run it through this X-ray machine, and then we could actually X-ray into the machine, or into the canister, and we could see the turndowns of the stages, meaning the little round corners. And if it met certain measurements, then we knew it was a certain type of missile. And so that's how we verified that it was a permitted type of missile coming out and not a non or prohibited type of missile. And so we would do this. This would take about 2.5 hours to do all that. They started bringing out a new type toward the end of my time there. It was an improved version of the SS-25. And actually, it was not just improved, it was actually a new missile type. It got so complicated what we went through, sometimes it would take us up to 12 to 14 hours to go through an inspection. And these usually came out at night because they were going to leave on a train the next morning. So at about 7, 8 o'clock at night, we'd get this notice, and we would work through the night until 7 or 8 in the morning. And if it was 40 below zero, you inspected. If it was 80 above, you inspected. Didn't matter. We had to do our stuff. So basically, this was our facility that was manned by Americans. And they would, guard us, making sure that we weren't going outside of that area. Okay. Any questions about that so far? All right. Okay. And twice a day, we would also walk the perimeter of the facility. This was about 4 or 5 kilometers. And we would walk the perimeter to make sure they didn't knock a hole through the back and take something out the back. And in the wintertime, which was most of the year, we would ski it. We would do cross-country skiing. And I remember one night we were skiing, and it was about, 2 o'clock in the morning. And we had got back to this area, and this is a massive birch forest. And we were back in this area, and we stopped to take a break. We were just tired, middle of the night. And the snow was falling, and literally, it was covering us up. We looked like little snowmen out there. And the snow was just coming out real gentle. There was no wind, and there's a big full moon. It was like something out of a dream. It was like, this can't be real. I'm in the middle of Russia with the snow coming down and all this. It was just really, really cool. So anyway, let me move on. Okay, these are pictures of the facilities, those buildings that I just mentioned to you. This is Roosevelt, the closest one to the entrance. That's me. You can see this is obviously wintertime. And the sign here says United States On-Site Inspection Agency, Balkans, Russia, in English. And everything we did was in English and Russian so that both sides could see, what was being said. But we never wore uniforms on site. We wore civilian clothes only. That was by treaty. We were not allowed to wear uniform items, so we didn't. During trips over there, we never had uniforms at all. We did have nice clothes for meetings and stuff like that, but normally we'd just wear jeans and flannel shirts and whatever was warm. And really good boots, because it was always wet and slushy. Yeah. You guys ever seen these kind of things, where they have the poles that show you places around the world, right? This is Volcano. You can see it was at 57 degrees north latitude, which is pretty far north. It's about the same as Helsinki, Finland. 54 east, and then you can see this says Salt Lake City's like 5,600 miles that way, and Tokyo's 4,000 miles that way, and Los Angeles and Bora Bora and Albuquerque and all these different places they put up there. Somebody thought it'd be funny. But this is what Russia looks like most of the year. You can see this is probably 3 to 4 feet of snow at this point. Just trying to keep the walkways open. We had one guy, he worked almost full time, shoveling snow. We had snow blowers, all that kind of stuff, but it snowed a lot. And we had to keep it all open and running. This is a small facility right outside the main gate. This is called the Data Control Center. This was manned by at least 2 contractors and 1 government personnel like myself, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This American flag, the Russian flag. And this looked toward the front of the gate, so if they brought something out, we would know that they were moving stuff and we could stop it. Okay. We did a lot of skiing. This is an Army officer I worked with named Pete Brigham. You can see who that guy is. We actually got invited to go downhill skiing in Russia. Normally we would cross-country ski, and they said there's a downhill skiing area. Would you guys like to go? We said, okay, let's give it a try, right? So they drove us over this place. And when I think of downhill skiing, I think of like, the Rockies, where you get up there and you ski for, 20, 30 minutes to get to the bottom. And there are thousands of feet drop. This place had, 300 or 400 feet of drop, so you get to the top of the hill. It's kind of like the bunny slope at a real place. And you ski down and you'd be done in about 30 seconds. But they had a rope tow. You guys know what I'm talking about? With a rope tow where it's on a pulley on one end, a pulley at the top of the hill, and the rope goes up and down the hill, and you basically grab the rope, and it pulls you up the hill, and then you ski down. Well, this rope tow was made of wire, and it was obviously old because it was starting to fray. And I reached up, and I grabbed the wire, and the rope is sliding through your glove, and it basically is ripping my glove to shreds because of the little frayed wires, right? I finally get on tight, and it's pulling me up the hill. And I'm starting to get almost to the top of the hill, and there's a guy standing at the top of the hill with the controls for the rope tow. If something happens, he hits a button and it stops it. Well, he's up there talking to a couple girls. He's occupied. And I get to the top of the hill, and I let go and start to ski away. My jacket is caught on the frayed wires. And I can't get off the rope, or off the wire, and I'm coming toward the pulley. And this thing is like 6, 8 feet across. I mean, you go in there, it's going to take your arm off, right? And I start yelling, to get the guy's attention. He's so busy trying to pick up these girls that he's not paying attention. And so eventually, I'm like, what do? I basically unzip my coat and I dive out of my coat. And just as my coat starts to go in the pulley, he sees it and stops it, backs it up, gets my coat out, and he's like, oh, sorry, man. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't feel like good. I lost my left arm. But that day, we checked out this place, we did a little skiing, and then promptly put the place off limits to all of our personnel. Because we said this place is not up to the safety standards of an American skiing place. And we were afraid that somebody would get hurt. And another thing that we were really afraid of is if you go down this hill and you're not a very good skier and you break a leg, medical care is not as well developed in remote areas of Russia as you would like. And if you break your leg in a place like this, it could be a long time before you get any medical care. So we finally made the decision, you know what, it's just too dangerous for people to be out here doing it. So we enjoyed ourselves that day, and then we stopped everybody from going. But that was our job. Sometimes it's good to be the boss. Anyway, this is a picture of the factory. You can see the Russian buildings back here, the gates where the stuff would come out of. And our Russian escorts would work out of this building. Everywhere we went off of this site, we had to be escorted. If we wanted to go downtown and buy a roll of film, we had to put in a notification 24 hours in advance. They would drive us down there, take us to get the film, and then bring us back. And they were very, very strict. Russian government can be very strict. If you wanted, let's say you went down there, you went to the film place, you got a roll of film, you're walking out, you smell the bread shop next door, and it's like, man, that smells great. Let's go get a couple loaves of fresh bread. You tell your guide, can we go get bread? And they're like, no, I'm sorry, you didn't put it on your request. And they would drive us back to the site. You can fill out a request tomorrow for bread, and we'll take you back down.
That's crazy.
That's the Russian mentality was, you can only do what we give you permission to do. We, on the other hand, were the exact opposite. When the Russians were in Utah, they would say, we want to go shopping. We're like, okay. What do you want? It's like, well, we need the following. Well, we'll just take you down to the mall, and we'll drop you off down at the mall, and we'll come back and get you 4 hours later. Their guys would escort us around, like, not under guard, but with us to make sure we didn't do anything we were supposed to. We'd drop them off the mall 4 hours and say, we'll be back. Because the American mentality is, hey, we don't care what you do as long as you don't get in trouble, right? I mean, as long as you're not hurting anybody or causing problems, we don't care what you do. And so it was just a very different mentality. It used to drive us crazy that we had to go through all these procedures, but that was the rules of the game. And they were very strict, very strict. I had to put this photo in because this is the only photo that I have of an actual inspection going on. This is a rail car. We're actually measuring it with this big long tape. This guy is a Major Chip McCoy, and that is me. And the reason that this blew me away was I went online and I looked up pictures of Kent's portal monitoring facility, this place where I worked at, and up comes this photo, and I looked at it and went, holy cow, that back of that head looks familiar. That's me. Because I couldn't believe it, because we were not allowed to take photos during inspections. I have no idea who took this photo, and I have no idea how it ended up on the internet, but somebody obviously took this somehow, and it just happens to be me.
That's pretty cool.
So I was like, wow, I'm on the internet. So, and because of this arms control nonsense. But these are Russian escorts, and the Americans you can see in our American North Face ski gear. This is the insides of those buildings were decked out. We all had our own bedroom, like a little apartment. So we actually lived pretty good. We ate well. We had cooks feeding us. It was actually a pretty good deal. This is what crazy Americans do when they're bored in the wintertime. You can see there's snow everywhere. Somebody thought it'd be funny. These pink flamingos were all over the site. Somebody had brought them in. Thought it was pretty funny. But they decided, hey, let's get a photo out. You know, it looks like we're sunbathing, and it's probably about 0 degrees out or something. I'm not in that photo. I actually know this guy. This was taken years after I left. This guy was still there. His name was Mario Gargiulo.
That's kind of so cool.
He's a retired Army officer, but he's from Italy originally. This guy is just one of the nicest guys I've met in my life. But I guess if you are really bored and got nothing else to do, this is the crazy stuff you do.
So you can stay up.
I make a snow angel.
Yeah. By the way, one of the things that the Russians do for fun is we had a sauna on site, and you would go in and you would basically strip down naked. And there would be 3 or 4 people in there, and you'd put a felt hat on, because it's supposed to protect your head from the heat. And then one guy would get in the middle, and all the other guys would take birch branches, and they'd smack him.
What?
And they would smack the guy in the middle, and the idea was to basically, it made your blood vessels expand or something. They're trying to explain it to me. And it was supposed to release the toxins in your body. And so the first time you sit down in the middle, they go, sit in the middle. You sit down, they all start whacking you. You're like, what is going on here? It hurts. It's not very pleasant. But you get so hot in the sauna that eventually you can't take it. So you run outside, you dive in the snow, cool off, and then you go back in the sauna and get hot and dive in the snow. That's a normal thing, right? Well, they were explaining it to me, and so I said, oh, okay. So we go outside, you dive in the snow. Well, when it has been sitting there for a while, it gets that little crust on top. You know what I'm talking about? Man, you hit that, and it's like, oh, man, it's like knives cutting you and that kind of stuff. It was awful. But the Russians love this kind of stuff. It was a little more painful for me, but anyway, a little fun on site. This is me in downtown Volcano, right by the Tchaikovsky Museum. It's called the Prude, this lake area. And in the wintertime, this would all be frozen over, and you'd see these guys, just little specks out there doing their ice fishing. Anything to catch a fish. I love this photograph because you look at it, that's our local Russian market, and it's like, I wonder which one's the American. Look at all the dark, drab clothes, and obviously, one of the guys I work with, Texas. He was one of our decent mechanics and that kind of stuff. But anyway, we would go down to the local market and buy food and various other things on occasion. Yes, sir.
Did they have sports in Russia, like football?
Oh yeah, sports are big. Soccer is huge. Let's see, soccer was big. Of course, winter sports, skiing, hockey is huge. All those kinds of things. Sports were very, very big in the Soviet Union and in Russia. Still are. That's basically the last photo. This is one of those rail cars being x-rayed in what we call the cargo scan. So I just kind of threw it in there. But anyway, that's basically the short version of what we were doing over there. Let me take this off real quick here. What questions do you guys have? We still got a minute or two. Anybody ever been to Russia? Anybody want to go to Russia? You been to Russia? Where'd you go?
Moscow.
In Moscow? What were you doing there?
I was visiting my sister.
You were what?
Visiting my sister.
She lives there?
Oh, she did.
She did? Well, that's pretty unusual. Most Americans have never been to Russia. Somebody else?
Oh, I want to go.
You want to go? It's fascinating. If you get a chance to go,
I
take
came
it.
close, but China's the closest.
It's worth it. Moscow is a very interesting city. There's all kinds of sights and things to see and do. 2 summers ago, I was in St. Petersburg, which used to be called Leningrad. Another beautiful, interesting city with all kinds of historical stuff. Moscow and St. Petersburg are the 2 biggies. There are some other very interesting places in Russia, but most Americans that go to Russia go to those 2 places. To get off the beaten path is pretty unusual because, it's so big and a lot of places don't have a lot, to offer you, so most of the tourists go to those. But if you get the opportunity, to go on a tour or something, I would highly recommend it. It's fascinating. And if you learn to speak Russian, it's even better because you can talk to the locals and see what's really going on.
Have a good time.
Have a good time. There you go. Yeah, there were definitely a lot of good times. And if you're older, the Russians drink like fish. They really do. It's not just. It's not just a
Myth.
It's not a myth. There's a lot of drinking going on. Actually, it's pretty sad in some cases because alcoholism is pretty rampant.
Well, yeah, what kind of people are they? Like how they had to learn how to smile?
Well, at the offices and that, they're very friendly to their friends and that kind of stuff. Actually, what I found was the Russians that I worked with and met were extremely friendly people. They would invite you to their homes. They would, I mean, these are people that don't have much, and they would put out a big spread of food when they don't have much to give. And they were really, really hospitable. We would always make sure we bring something practical in return, like, here's 5 pounds of sugar or something, that might be useful to them. But they were extremely hospitable, very, very nice people. The only times we ever had issues was when we were dealing with the government. The government can be very difficult. Of course, our government can be very difficult at times too. But most Russians that I met were very hospitable, nice people. And in many ways, they were not much different than you. They wanted to go to work. They wanted to hang with their friends on a Friday night, play sports, music. Some of the things that really impressed me was they're very well read, and when it comes to like the arts and things like that, they're way ahead of us. I mean, kids all learn to dance. I saw kids. You guys ever watch like Dancing with the Stars on TV, ballroom dancing? Little 10-year-old kids that are dancing like those people on the shows. I mean, they were amazing. And a lot of it had to do with their lack of alternatives. Like, you guys have a lot of stuff to do. And of course, it's becoming more and more common in Russia to have Xboxes and those kind of things. But years and years ago, they didn't have a whole lot. So you played sports, you learned how to play musical instruments, you learned how to play chess. You did things that kept you busy and learned about art and all those kind of things. They were pretty amazing. Amazing. Oh, I got to tell you another quick story. We have till 22, is that right? No, 16. Okay, quick story. We got invited, the site commander and I was the deputy site commander, we got invited to a festivity down in a local school. It was like the 35th anniversary of the school. And all the teachers there were female. And after the little show was over, they said, we've got a little layout of food afterwards, like a picnic kind of thing. You're invited to come and eat with us. So we started eating and drinking and having fun and all that kind of stuff with the Russians. And a few minutes into the whole thing, they said, okay, it's time to dance. They love to dance. And there's 2 guys in the room. There's me and the site commander. So you can imagine we were very popular to dance with, right? This lady comes over and she says, come on, let's dance. And it's like a waltz or something. I can't dance. I told her in Russian, I can't dance. She goes, oh, yeah, you can dance. No, really, I can't dance. And she says, sure you can. She pulls me out there, and about 2 steps in, I'm stepping on her feet. She has these eyeballs as big, like, oh my gosh, this guy really can't dance. He's terrible. But I danced a lot that afternoon, even though I didn't want to. Yeah, they made me. Question in the back.
The clock stopped.
Clock stopped? Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
But
Go ahead and take care of it.
Dismiss.
Go do great things!